Hey, welcome back to Everyday Economics, the podcast that helps you learn about the economic world happening around you every day. I'm your host, Chris Krug, president of the 501c3 nonprofit, nonpartisan Franklin News Foundation. Everyday Economics, a production of America's Talking Network. You can check out all of our great podcasts at americastalking.com. To support Everyday Economics, please make your tax-deductible charitable contribution by clicking the link in the show description. We're recording this episode on Monday, June 5th. Joining me as always, my partner, Dr. Orphe Divounguy, PhD economist, Dr. O, housing. We talk about it on this show a lot. It is a core piece of the economy. It is one of the staples for life. It's a necessity. People need places to live. The future of housing as we know it, it's evolving. And not to go all the way over the line to like tiny homes and, prefabricated, former shipping container homes. That's becoming part of a segmentation of the marketplace. I've even had friends that have talked about buying an old building and renovating it and living together in retirement, creating their own retirement community, which I think is somewhat fascinating, in particular if they are able to pull it off in an urbanized area. But the future of housing is what, in your opinion, and why? Why is it changing?
Putting this out there, I'm doing a little preview of a talk I'm giving this week. And the future of housing, if you look at the housing market right now, let's talk about the demand side first, because I think builders will build what people want. So if you look at the demand side, you have a younger, highly educated, tech savvy, health conscious, and climate conscious consumer. And that's why builders will have to cater to these individuals, to these new families that are being formed that are highly educated, tech savvy, health and climate conscious. What does that mean? Well, the first, family size, right? You have highly educated people with fewer children, right? Fertility rates in America have been declining for, can't remember exactly, but a few decades now. Family size has shrank a lot. The typical family in the US is now two people, two individuals. That's it. No kids. On average, we still have about three and a quarter, maybe, family members. And so that's been shrinking. You also have an aging population with a lot of older Americans who are likely going to want to downsize because they can't handle their vast yards anymore and these big detached single family houses. They're going to want to downsize. And so you have that combination of like younger families and older families that are shrinking. And that will likely result in smaller spaces. We also have the fact that space has gone more expensive. Space is more costly than it used to be. With mortgage rates as high as they are now, last time I checked, 6.9%. What we started to see in the data was that a competition for smaller homes, more affordable units, had remained very strong and was actually even heating up this spring in this spring housing market. I think that's actually here to stay.
The challenge there, though, has become the affordability of that first home and what that number had to be. I mean, once upon a time our first house that we bought in the Chicago suburbs, 1998, was $176,000. And that was a stretch for us. Now, I believe if you wanted to buy that house, I think you're looking at maybe more like $250,000 on the bottom end. And that's, less than 25 years later. And that's in the Illinois or greater Chicago housing market, which is largely lagged behind the rest of the country. So, that first level home is becoming challenging for anybody.
Totally. But as long as interest rates were low, that wasn't so much of a problem, right? Because really
25 years ago, we bought at 7 5/8. We're delighted by that interest rate.
That's right. No, totally. So what we got during that time period is lower interest rates, right? We went into the global financial crisis. Interest rates fell. We had a whole decade, 12 years of low inflation, like lower than the Fed's target. And interest rates are so low during that time period. And then we got hit by COVID and interest rates fell even more. And so, and during that time period, by the way, incomes increased. So the cost of housing, the cost of owning that home was actually lower during that time period. And so that was helping people. But when I talk about smaller units, I'm not just talking about the bottom rung of the ladder. You have millionaire homes that are shrinking as well. People want to spend less, right? And sometimes they're not even spending less. It's just that space has gone more costly. So you get less space to fit in your budget. but at the same time, they want to reduce their carbon footprint to the best of their ability. And so that's kind of where housing is headed. And then you have issues like what we saw in the news. I was surprised. And in the news last week, Arizona Governor Katie Hobbs announced construction around Phoenix will be limited moving forward to protect groundwater supplies. You got a place like Phoenix, Arizona, that's basically running out of water. Phoenix relies on imported Colorado River water and uses water from the in-state Salt and Verde rivers. And we're in trouble in some parts of the country. And what does that do? And I wrote about this almost a year ago, too. These ongoing concerns in some parts of the country are going to cause, at least in the short run, housing costs to increase. You have, record domestic migration to places like Florida and places like Phoenix, Arizona. And all this demand is going to come in. And unless we build fast enough to absorb this demand, housing costs are going to continue to increase, right? At least in the short run. And I think in the long run, when people realize that, there's all this trouble in some of these most beautiful places, right? Beautiful places. We love Phoenix, Arizona. Unfortunately, rising housing costs in those areas are going to deter people from moving there. And so I think going forward, policymakers are going to be faced with this challenge, right? Of like, how do we keep our localities growing? How do we do that in the face of these issues that we're having with the water supply and the wildfires and the floods? And I mean, last week you had State Farm Insurance refusing to insure people in California. I don't know if you remember the headline. So it's happening, and again, this is where housing is going, in my opinion.
Too many losses. And the insurance business does that a lot. I mean, you've got companies like Erie Insurance, for example. I mean, many years ago decided that they weren't going to insure automobiles in certain states in the Southeast because they didn't want the business. It was losses. I mean, I think for us, perspective would be beneficial here, right? So let's pull back and I'll ask you a question and we'll call it good for today. Hasn't what you're describing with regard to pressures on desirable markets, warmer weather areas, and for this case, let's say Arizona, and I referenced the Southeast, but let's talk about Florida. Haven't over the last 50 years, there have been waves of booms and busts in those markets, not necessarily driven by climate or access to water specifically, or any other factor than unbridled enthusiasm to move somewhere nice.
Totally. There's been booms and busts. And again, I mean, if we did get that crash, that hard landing, you're going to get, interest rates dropping again and people saying, hey, maybe I can go and buy myself a house in Florida, right? Or in San Francisco, California. I'm sure we're going to get a lot of that. So what I'm talking about now is kind of the structural things that are going to affect the housing market. The fact that the consumer has changed, the fact that the U.S. population is aging, and that unless we get a surge in immigration, we're going to have older Americans downsizing, and we're going to have American family size shrinking. That's kind of a structural thing that is not a related to the business cycle. And I'm talking about the climate issue. Could it be all of a sudden we discover new water supplies and it helps to get builders to build in Phoenix and people wanting to go to Phoenix? Possibly. But, as long as we see this trend, things headed in that direction, I think that people are going to take less and less risk. They're going to start to internalize the risk of moving to some of these areas. And that means they're going to move elsewhere, right? They're going to move where, again, it's not even just about the climate. They're just going to move where things are cheaper, more affordable.
I think that's frankly more likely. Thank you for the insights as always.
Oh, it was a pleasure. It's always good on the podcast. We have a lot of fun. And I hope this was insightful for our listeners.
I think it was terrific. For Dr. O, this has been Chris Krug. Subscribe to Everyday Economics and dozens of other quality podcasts at americastalking.com.